There's sort of two recordings that I want to make simultaneously, but the topics are so disparate. They're very vaguely connected. Anyway, I'll just put the one out of my mind for now, since it's sort of, or I guess it's political arguments that relate to psychological phenomena, which are, sort of very uh, central in, let's say, the current zeitgeist and such. Um, but yeah, I haven't made a recording on my psychological models for a long time, and I need to sort of update, or I would like to make a recording that updates my thinking on the matter. There are no easy ways to sort of say this. I don't respect my own methodology, essentially, which is somewhat problematic from an intellectual position. So, it feels like I'm sort of scurrying about, with sort of arcane, I'm sort of being inspired by the Book of Revelations, uh, using it as a codex to break down the structures and the models of psychology, which I essentially don't know how to interpret. Like I've modeled the false ego complex, but just because you know the scope or the terrain of the issues, or let's just say you have a general knowledge of the problem, doesn't mean you have an understanding of the problem in the vogue of trying to bring it to some kind of reconciliation or resolution or transmutation. So, just having general knowledge about the terrain of the problem is not the same thing as understanding the problem. And, so I'm looking for inspiration. And, um, I've always, and I guess the reason why I say I don't respect my methodology is because it's not really, it cannot be understood. Or that's what I'm doing, sort of poking around, trying to generate understanding, and trying to work out how, and there is a huge, sort of metaphorical component. I mean, the dream of St. John has, seemingly goes through the same processes by different angles of accounting for it. You're given all these different aspects. Certain things seem to be repetitively, or there's certainly a sophisticated sequence of events, and in some of the sequence, some of the events are, I think, being recapitulated from another um, point of view within the let's say the all the workings of the mind, which are also themselves symbolized, in many different ways. The throne of God with the four beasts around it and the 24 elders, and these beasts that have different heads, one of a lion, one of a calf, one of a man, and one of an eagle. Which I think that I mean I when I was constructing my models, I used four alchemical elements, and I think that anyway. I mean, I can give my translations of where I think these things are, and each of these beasts have 6 wings. 4 times 6 is 24. So if you can understand that each beast symbolizes um, 3 of the 12 model. So each beast has and the beasts are also described as having eyes that look inward. Anyway, so I think that essentially the 12 extraction from the 17. So when you have the 12 and the final five would pertain to the throne of God, and then the 12 surrounding it is organized as these 3 beasts, and I can alchemically call them the alchemical elements, or the figure of um, uh, the the figures of the lion, the calf, the man, and the eagle. Um, with 6 wings. That each of those 4 elements does have 6 orientations if it's made up of 3 of the 12. So for example, okay, well, I mean, I'm just going straight into it. I was going to give more of a narrative of contextualizing my translation of this, but anyway, I mean, this is, in some sense, this is just this is not as important as the later discoveries that I've made, but I'm just going to start talking about this just so it's kind of on record. So how I see it is that that each of these beasts has a particular 3 of the 12. And so, for example, if I've got my alchemical translation with the figures of the heads of these angels, then the lion would be symbolic of the alchemical air element, and that is made up of dimension 13. Dimension 8 and dimension 4, which are all the aught or the wood. So 13 is why would it be, or why things would be, or faith. 13 is the dimension of faith. The 8th dimension is appraisal, how things would be, which also is very connotative of the earth itself, in the biblical sense of the earth, not in the alchemical sense of the earth. And dimension 4 is moderation, what ought to be, which is symbolic of also the water. And not the alchemical water, again, the biblical water. And then the calf, I link that to the water alchemical element, which is, and I'm giving it in the, because each thing is made up of three dimensions from the 12 extraction of the 17, and I'm giving them in the same order. So the first element, the first function that I give is the Vaik one. The second one is the Rajasic one, and the third one is no, that's not true, because I give 8. 8 is the Tamasic one. So anyway, so I'm just going to try and keep a similar convention. Anyway, okay, so it goes in order. So I'll speak it in the order of Sattva, Tamas, and Rajas. Okay. So the calf then is made up of dimension 2, which is also symbolic of the spirit, dimension 10, which is the elder or trust, or what ought to be. Sorry, the spirit, dimension 2, is how things, not ought, how things shall be or how things should be, and trust is what should be or what shall be. So your sense of what shall be is your sense of trust. And then the last one, the Rajasic one, is is why things shall be. Dimension 6, eminence, which is also symbolic of the salt. So that's the calf, and then the man, the angel with the head of a man, is made up of what will be, instinct, the first dimension, which is symbolic of the flesh. The fifth, no, so let me put it in the right order. The 9th dimension, which is hope, or which is symbolic of discerning, or also the gift of the apostle. Why things will be. So the flesh is what will be, and the hope, or the discerning, or the gift of the apostle is why things will be. And then the last one, the Rajasic function, is how things will be, which is prudence, the fifth dimension. Sorry, I hope I gave all the numbers. Yeah, I did. Okay, and then the last one, the eagle, is made up of is the alchemical earth element, which are all the is. So it's in order. It's why things are, or why things is. You see, you don't go why is. You have to say why things are some way or something like that. Which is the 12th dimension, reason or liberty, I call it, to know why things are. And then the second is dimension 17 is the Tamasic, which is I call it tranquility, how things are, which is also symbolically connected with the gift of the prophet. And then dimension 15 is the Sattvic earth component. Sorry, I keep on mixing up Sattva and Rajas in my head because a long time ago. Anyway, sorry. The 15th dimension is the Rajasic dimension, which is what things are, which I call exuberance, and which is connected with the gift of the evangelist. It's also, I would say, symbolically connected with Malkuth and in the kingdom. But anyway, so yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that so I haven't exactly worked out if so there are these four elemental beasts, angels or whatever, but when they actually function, they function always in conjunction with one another. But you need one to have a propitiating starting point. So, for example, so they need to lean on one another. They need to inflect on one another. So, like, the one will have an orientation of one of its wings, one of its six wings. Which is, you could just basically see it as a polarization of one of the three components. So one of the three components will either be positively charged or negatively charged, and that I think is symbolic of the six wings that each of them has. And when one of the wings is positively charged or negatively charged, then one of the other elements will have a corresponding wing that conjoins. There are only two options for each orientation. Actually, no, that might be wrong. There might be four. No. Oh well. If you look at it going both ways, then it's four. But if you look at it going one way, in terms of it propitiating from one of the angels, so if one of the figures of the angels has let's say the prime definitive, because yeah, so basically one of the three components can either, let's say, be inducing its own displacement, or let's say supplementation of itself from another element from one of the other angels, composed in one of the other angels. So it's making space for one of the other angels to sort of to cover the orientation of that wing, or something like that, of which that then there are two options. There are two possible conjunctions to fill in that inducement, or that orientation of the one wing. But if you just want to generically say that the orientation of that wing can be part of actually four possible, not knowing if it's the leader or the follower, not knowing if it was the propitiating orientation or the secondary orientation that conjoins with the primary or first one. Anyway, that's not that important. So basically, this is just a technical breakdown, which is just somewhat stupid for me to verbalize, because it could be depicted much more easily. But basically, then, because each of these angels has three component parts inside of it, three eyes, inward-looking eyes, and each of those eyes can be put into three sets. You basically see that basically there's always I have to make sure that I don't misspeak, I guess. You end up with getting three sets of 8 combinations. Oh, right, how to describe this? Anyway, I mean, it's almost not that important, but and some of those set of 8 will always involve 2 types of element within each element or within each angel. If you categorize the 3 subcomponents in each angel as having 3 distinct labels or characters, sattva, rajas, and tamas, as I did it in the order of sattva, tamas, and rajas. That all the rajasic emotions are always made up of the rajas component within each angel or each alchemical element, and actually, I think it's easier to speak it in relation to the wings. Then, so you could just say that yeah, that does actually make it easier to explain. That that each element has 2 sattvaic wings, 2 tamasic wings, and 2 rajasic wings, and there are, and then just to take it by definition of how the system works and comes together, that each pair of wings that are of a particular type, sattva, rajas, or tamas, will comprise each particular pair of wings will go into, or if you count those wings as interchangeable, each pair of wings will be involved in 4 combined outputs. Will be part of the recipe of 4 conjunctions between the elements. And anyway, and then I'm just trying to describe that the set of 8 outputs follow a kind of pattern in which it's always going to be, for example, one Sattvaic wing and one Rajasic wing. Should have said Rajas first though, because so like a Rajasic wing and a Sattvaic wing makes a Rajasic emotional tone, and a Sattvaic wing and a Tamasic wing makes a Sattvaic emotional tone, and a Tamasic wing and a Rajasic wing makes a tamasic emotional tone. Anyway, it's not that important, but anyway, and so the reason why that there are 6 wings is because there are 3. I mean, or you could say that there are, maybe there are 6 inward-looking eyes, but there are 3 basic components that each have 2 polarities. When they form these conjunctions with the other wings, in some sense you can almost see it as a. Anyway, I haven't really exactly worked out all the pertinence or the relevance of these elements themselves as an independent thing, other than the fact that I think that when consciousness, when the final 5, the seat of consciousness is experiencing life and reality, it has essentially this breakdown of cognitive choice, essentially, that it has these, let's say, particular appendages of faculty in terms of animating cognitive grammar, providing a tone of understanding or of consciousness of something. You have to actually and that this is something of just a kind of let's say the primary colors of the grammar and tone that meaning can be constructed, that objects that have significance and that make some kind of sense to the core sense of the awareness of the being, of the final 5, which is in some sense the sense of self and the core I mean, I think that's why it's depicted as the throne, because it's essentially, it's where the agency of the sovereign elective force of judging reality within the field of consciousness. Uh, anyway, I don't want to get too much into weird abstract things. Anyway, so those are, let's say, the four beasts, because and in some sense this relates to, I don't want to get too mystical, but essentially this relates to the blood, I would say, or which is one of the final five. It's one of the basic components, but essentially the reason why there are four beasts that praise the throne of God is because I mean the blood itself is an interesting doctrinal point, but I don't like going down these little rabbit holes, but I'll just elaborate on this because it is somewhat relevant. But so the seventh dimension of psychological reality, the blood, is somewhat like it's like the RAM in your computer. It's kind of like the spirit has to cash itself out as a kind of charged up latent bundle and reservoir of potential energy. So the understanding has to sort of translate itself into something that's expendable or usable. But by the time that it's uploaded into the RAM, it already becomes materialized as, in some sense, something that sustains the flesh, conserves the flesh, and also perhaps has to deal with the substrate of the flesh itself. But there are interesting things in the scriptures. That I mean, obviously, the blood of Christ is somewhat something slightly different to this, because the blood of Christ, I would say, is something like the spiritual understanding, and let's say the proper use of blood. Generically, the spiritual character that blood has, but essentially it's a weird spiritual character, because the blood will not inherit the kingdom. Flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom. It is said in the scriptures. So there is something of the need of the capacity of the blood to sacrifice itself, but it's almost it's not there just to be shed wantonly. It is, but essentially it does hold the purpose. It is the reservoir of purpose, but it's been uploaded into the material arena. So it can, at some point you have to deal with the problem of when the spirit has been quickened, that the blood is still got some latent charge that is not up to date with the new operation of the spirit, and so it has to somewhat be capable of sacrificing itself for the spiritual understanding, for allowing itself to be spilt, as it were. And that's very hard to sort of work out what part of the blood is a necessary component of the channel of manifestation, essentially, for actually deriving, because this is such a difficult and sophisticated topic to get into, but I can kind of give an example to kind of go into it, which would be like the blood is really like the effect of consciousness, the after effect of consciousness. So it is the context within which your consciousness sits as well. So, if you make bad decisions, if you don't sleep well, if you eat things that, that you have decided to eat. It's sort of, it does have a kind of an assumption of a bootstrapped agency, if you want to make it spiritual, but within the band of decisions that you have a quality of blood which gives you a certain potential energy. If you just want to say that the blood is a reservoir of, let's just say, pure caloric units of energy, and if you don't have enough energy, you don't have enough fuel for your cells to actually be able to effectuate your purpose. Now, that's an oversimplified example, because I would even say that it's not about eating enough calories so that you're able to do activity that you want to do, that you have the motivation to do, that you have the understanding that endorses the motivation to do it, as well as also perhaps negative motivations, or let's say motivations that you have to hunger and thirst and things like that, which themselves are, who knows, in terms of being able to differentiate between a useful potential and having a certain reservoir of potential activity, and it just being a kind of, let's say, vanity or self-aggrandizement or something like that. But essentially, the mind is essentially somewhat directing the uptake of this, of let's say, charging the blood with some kind of potential. Now, it's much more than just potential energy in some kind of generic form, because I would say that this is happening on a much deeper level in terms of the blood, not just in terms of energy, but in terms of purpose and motivation. That you might have this sense and understanding of what one needs to do, and that might, let's say, translate into having a particular hunger for a particular kind of food or something like that, which will fortify the blood or something like that. So, and this gets so messy, because it's sort of like I'm trying to give an example of something spiritual, and the thing that I'm trying to explain, which is spiritual, is itself very much connected with the material plane. And so, the transcendental quality that blood has, further things also have to sort of, you can't just take this subject in isolation. It's not really useful in isolation to even explore it, because you can't refine yourself by refining your blood. You have to do other things, essentially. But this is, let's say, an indirect component or parallel thing that relates to let's say the other more discrete and direct components of regulating the blood. So yeah, it's sort of it's not something that because in some sense it's not something that you can sort of operate on. You can't operate on your blood. You're always within its context or something like that. So there's no sort of way of just, it's always the conduit, it's always the vehicle, it's always the reservoir of potential that is, driving you. And in some sense, it's not usually the predominant, it's all happening inside of the blood. So it's not, anyway, it's always all happening inside the blood. So what is my point here? Is just that I mean, one of essentially the traps of the blood is that you can think that you can sort of develop an objectivity about it. In a sense, it's all about making room to freely be able to move and shift in or changing or altering the content of your power and self-interest. So as to have a properly regulated channel of manifestation. But anyway, I need to make a recording about, anyway, the 17 functions. But why am I talking about the blood so much? Is how does that relate to the elements? Anyway, yeah, so I think that essentially because the blood, everything above the seventh dimension of psychological reality is happening within the blood, essentially, or can be reduced down into into basically the blood. So all of heaven, in some sense, is also reducible down to something that is working within that layer of cognitive functionality, that shared operation, or potentially shared cognitive operation. Anyway, that, I mean, that what I just said is probably something that I shouldn't, is probably slightly erroneous, even what I just said, because the 17 model is more holistic than that as well. You know, sort of the final 5 around these 12. If that is, let's say, the basic model, then these things are happening all simultaneously and corresponding and correlative to one another. But essentially, I guess to eat any one of the final 5, not even just the blood. The 4 beasts are a basic category of who knows? I mean, maybe the final five are also. I mean, it's hard to talk about the final five because the Trinity component of the final five, is probably deeply mirrored entirely in the blood as well, and also in that kind of that still don't know what to call it, sort of the fire in the eyes, or or perhaps the holy fire, or the Lord God of hosts. Which is the most basic component of the final five, or is the closest to anyway. But yeah, I guess the strange thing is that has so much of a. So I'm going right now in my mind into the genealogy of the kind of the epistemological genealogy of the fall, and it's just, I still probably need to study Revelations to work out, because I mean it talks about, sometimes when it's describing the beast itself, or one of the motifs of the beast, of the actual, which I think is symbolic of the false ego complex, of the problem itself. It gives all these weirdly different sort of accounts, and descriptions of different components of it. And I'm thinking of one where it is given a lot of these component characters of even merging some of the four beasts around the throne of God, where it talks about that it has, I think it's the head of a ram or something like that, and also a face of an eagle. So it's this weird kind of appropriation of these four beasts that are around. It's a chimera extraction that has gone into fortifying the false ego complex. Anyway, and what I was just thinking before that was how essentially maybe one of the components of the final five that I spoke about is perhaps has a greater connection with the Holy Ghost, and the blood has a greater connection with the Father and the Son. But anyway, that's these are things that are very and therefore, it's more relevant to talk about the blood, because it's much more relatable, because the Holy Ghost itself is such a pervasively sort of philosophically broad topic, and it's not where the nexus of the general reconciliation and solution of these things are. But anyway, I just, okay. Let me just stop talking about this, because it's getting nowhere quickly. Okay, so that topic I'm just going to lay to rest now. So the work that I have been doing now and been focusing on is just trying to get more familiar with my structure of the false ego complex, with the structure of the mind, in a robust and comprehensive understanding, and also an understanding that is connected with a viable treatment, or process of self-actualization. And I think I have some things are coming into very clear view, so I'm going to talk about those things. So, man, this is going to be slightly embarrassing if I get this wrong, but I think it's in chapter 17 of Revelations. It talks about interesting things, and I think that chapter 17 is a very interesting moment as well. But that's where I am focused, because that's, I think, where I am in my understanding. In some sense, the earlier parts are preparatory parts of the general sequence of the revelation of God. And there's this motif that keeps on coming up in Revelation, where it says that essentially it talks about that the wrath of God is essentially being produced like wine, that the grapes are being harvested and are being processed, so that the wrath of God, which is right and which is true, and good things are said, but it's a laborious process that you have to go through quite a lot in order to precipitate the wrath of God. But it really is a wrath that will bring a solution to the problem. But essentially, it's very interesting that essentially that is the symbolism that is used. And so in some sense, I think that is the kind of, anyway, so I think that I've been going through that sort of that dawning process of perfecting, this particular wine of the wrath of God. That it doesn't, it's not obvious. It has to kind of percolate. It has to, anyway. All this while also having to work out exactly, what pertains to what and what is related to what. So I think, so what I'm going to talk about is the structure of the false ego complex, and how my model of understanding the overarching structure. And there's still a few holes in this narrative, sadly, or at least in the mechanical side of how to understand my model. There's some holes in that, but at least the translation, I think, is generally workable. So I just want to get it out there, or at least have a record of it. So I see it like this. There are 4 sides of the mind. There are 8 sort of overarching operations that are connecting these sides of the mind with each other, which is a slightly complicated relay system between parents and inferior functions, and the weird asymmetry between the ego and the superego. And that asymmetry also is what means that essentially the false ego complex had a beginning, and it has a particular resolution and an end. And anyway, let me talk about the structure of it. So I'm not going to recapitulate too much, because I've talked about those relays and discussed them in other recordings. So this is, you see, there's still questions that keep on looming for me on so there is variance and there's speculation that still needs to be had about this. But essentially, when I developed Metatype, I didn't do so with the model of 4 sides of the mind. I did so with the model of 3 sides of the mind. And I think that there was fidelity to me making that mistake, if I can call it a mistake. And chapter 17 in Revelations has a model that makes sense of this discrepancy in my original model. So in my original model, I have six components, 6 relays that combine with each other. And I call them the stimulus, the primary counteroffer, and the emergent response. The stimulus is made up of the devotion and the declaration. The primary counteroffer is made up of the prayer and the answer, and sorry, I should say answer and the prayer to keep the same. And the emergent response is made up of the worship and the declaration. Anyway, so those are 6 things. Now, in chapter 17, man, I hope I've got that right. Anyway, but in the last, quite late in Revelations, it talks about 7 kings. You know, it talks about 7 kings and an 8th. Oh no, it doesn't. Okay, it says 7 kings. It says 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. And then it says that there is a beast which is of the 7. So there are actually 8 things, because there are 7 kings and an 8th is a beast. And 5 of the kings are fallen, 1 of the kings is, and 1 of the kings is yet to come. Now, this might need to be repopulated. I mean, I might be wrong about this, but I think this at least this model, this overlay that I have for this, I think works. Is that okay? So by the way, my original description of the mind just had 6 relays, not 8. It had 6. Now it has 8, because I added what I call the condemnation, which is made up of the question and the just if, or I think I actually came up with better terminology, but anyway, that'll do for now. Now, the question, I think, is actually the king. That is. And the just if, I believe, is the beast, because the just if imposes the sin on the ego, and the sin of the ego is also the death of the superego. So I think that conditionality, which is the meaning of the death itself, is essentially the beast. Okay, so I think that, and so what imposes that death, which is also the sin of the ego, and that death in the superego, is the parent function in the superego, which is the false prophet, and that mark of death, that is essentially also that fallen character. Or I don't want to use fallen because that conflicts weirdly with, or not necessarily actually, but anyway. So basically, I think that therefore the dominant function in the superego is basically Babylon the Great, that is built on the blood of the saints. And what is and the parent function in the ego that is essentially performing the man, I don't have my notes with me. It's probably the devotion. Yeah, it's the devotion. That is performing the devotion from the ego's parent function into the subconscious's death, or the superego's inferior function. That devotion that is being performed there usually that would sort of be going over the head of the superego, but the superego essentially doesn't have a functioning dominant function. It's vacuous, or it's porous. a better description of it is that it's fractured, and this is described also in Revelations as the kings and merchants in Babylon the Great are essentially disparate, that they are all drunk on the wrath of the fornication with the whore. So the parent function is the whore of Babylon, and it's sort of the devotion that is carried out that goes over the dominant function is in some sense also anyway, that is probably one of the fallen kings. Not I have to put an asterisk there, because essentially I think that essentially there are the five fallen kings are always are five of the six, are always five of the six, and so it's actually which one of them is the one that is yet to come is shifting around, and that anyway I don't want to talk about this yet. I'm just saying that the devotion itself has a reflection of itself in the fragmentation of the superego's dominant function. That's all I want to focus on now, is that essentially that is what makes the character of Babylon the Great operative. That's what makes the blood of the saints that Babylon the Great is built out of is this fragmented and disrupted saint's blood. Saint is a believer. So anyway, I still think that essentially this is the ground that should be held by the New Jerusalem. So the New Jerusalem should be here, but instead it's fragmented, and you've got many kings and many rich merchants that are sort of disrupted values that don't have a hierarchy. They are all sort of competing for the affection of the whore, essentially, or something like that. They're all trying to model these things in these disparate ways. It's fundamentally fragmented. So anyway, there's a disrupted dominant function in the superego. And in some sense also, all of that disruption is founded in the death, in the conditionality. So it has a corresponding conditionality. So, I mean, that you could say the biggest problem here is the death. The death is the death of the superego is the nexus of all the bad things, which is essentially sealed by, I'll call it the mark of the false prophet or something like that. The just if, which I do think is basically the mark of the beast, or because anyway, that I think is the beast. So that's so you have to see that the parent function in the superego, which is the false prophet, is actively imprinting the death onto the beast, and that conditionality of the beast is controlling and empowering the fragmentation of the dominant function in the superego. And that fragmentation in the superego's dominant function is being played out and mirrored in the 6 relays that are left over. And so instead of actually confronting that disunification of the dominant function in the superego, it is played out as a drama between the 6 relays, in which 5 of those relays are seen as lost and fallen because of the lack of the supplementary buttressing support and supply of something that is missing from a king that is not yet come. So there are 6 relays 5 of them are lost, or they're fallen kings. And then the idea is that if the one king would arrive, then the other 5 would then be in harmony. So there is this, essentially it's the weak link in the chain. The weakest link in the chain is regarded as the source of the lack of validity that would bring validity to the 5 fallen kings. So the 5 fallen kings would be reimbursed and would be verified by the coming of. So essentially you focus your attention on, you're scouring the 6 relays for the one relay that can supply what is needed to satisfy the other 5. And that jumping, or that focus between these relays, because these relays are not sequential relays, it's kind of like it's a bit of a spider web. And I believe that I have worked out what the true sequencing of those 6 relays are. So if okay, and this is what's slightly speculative, I haven't worked all of this out perfectly, but I mean, I've said before that I believe that, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas seem to me to have proclivities towards having a different profile of attention, that they seem to be grounded more in some aspect of these relays. They seem to have a preferential ordering of focus. Okay, so if that is true, then I mean, I still don't know on which side of the king that is yet to come. And maybe, you see, I don't know if because you see, like, I always put them in pairs of 2, and so, if any one of those 6 can be the king that is yet to come, that means that, and in some sense, that emphasis, it it would at least suggest that if what I'm saying is related to, is correct, or at least partially correct, that then there would at the very least be subvariants within Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, that essentially each even same metagram type might have an emphasis uh, that would produce a kind of stylistic permutation in how that type manifested. Anyway, that's not that important. But anyway, that would have. Sometimes that wouldn't change the architecture, and that wouldn't change, let's say, the stylistic components, but it would change, let's say, the proclivity that persona had in sort of living out that part of the sequence of the internal drama, or something like that, or that that would be the highest value that they were set towards attaining or striving toward, or something like that. And this gets complicated as well, because I think that it might not necessarily be stable at all, that individuals would even have a stable king that is yet to come. There might be variants or versions of emulating trading systems where you could actually have you could have a reinterpretation of these 6 relays to swap it around. In fact, this could also be explanatory of people that go through, sort of identity dysregulation. Um, that And then I think that bipolar, at least bipolar type 1, would also be potentially using this kind of it would be a more sophisticated version of this kind of problem, because I do actually think that bipolar circuitry, the sad thing is that, like, I mean, I've got very complicated notation, and that notation, all that does is I don't understand exactly what the notation means. I just know that I've got different notation for different types of circuits, because I know that those circuits function differently to one another. So I've got different distinctions between different circuit styles, if I could just say that. And I don't exactly know what that means, but I know that essentially the kind of sophistication within bipolar means that there's an alternative relay, that you don't have to go through the same emotional tone circuitry. There is seemingly it's like you can literally go an alternative route, and so you can create potentially cul-de-sacs, or of let's say trapped loops of charged and perhaps alternative schematic a variant interpretive anyway, in independent cognitive loop in some way. Um, and I do think that generally the only way to heal bipolar type 1 is essentially to move towards integration between those cognitive variants. I think essentially it sort of requires sacrifice, perhaps, from both, let's say, cognitive faculties or cognitive arms, to sort of both dumb themselves down into generalizing their perspective, and to work towards some kind of homogenization. Um, and in some sense to channel the metatype more than to channel the metagram type, um, with the resolution toward, with the general overarching resolution toward some kind of general solution to the problem of the false ego complex in some sense. So I do think that, let's say, high grade self-actualization is the only thing that can really heal bipolar. But the sort of the aberrant salience and things like that, I think, are essentially artifacts of a de facto internal suppression of, say, the preferences of one of the independent cognitive streams, and anyway, which is perhaps exacerbated if essentially one of those cognitive streams is essentially fixated on on a different king that is yet come. That then you have a kind of, to use, you get a kind of, to use a metaphor for eyesight, you get a sort of a stigmatization where you get essentially your focal point is dispersed between two poles, and you're getting um, a kind of a distortion, which is almost like a kind of wave feedback, sort of interfering resonance, that is being played out within the circuitry of these relays. Um, Almost like microphone feedback, amplifying itself, as kind of resonance, and charge is going through these relays in where some things are getting amplified and other things are getting cancelled out, and you're getting more and more sort of unstable noise. Anyway, until the whole thing sort of atrophies and in some sense breaks down, or tries to kind of, now the analogy might be way too weak to get anything out of it, but it essentially tries to interrupt itself and to restart from nothing or something like that. It tries to sort of dump its cache. It tries to sort of discharge everything so that it can be left to coalesce around one new operative coalescent, unification or something like that. So it's almost like a psychologically protective mechanism, just trying to sort of filter out the amplified noise. But anyway, let me just not get too bogged down in that kind of rabbit hole. But by the way, I still think that borderline is still focused on the king that is, which is the question. Okay, and I also wanted to talk more about this. So, talking also about how these fights within the relays, or let's say the king that is yet come, that might shift between one of these 6 relays, and the other 5 relays are fallen. That activity, I think, is being holographically projected from what is essentially happening in the dominant function of the superego, the fractured nature of that dominant function, which is in some sense underpinned by the conditionality and the imprint or the subjugation of the death of the superego, which is being sealed by the mark of the false prophet, which is the parent function in the superego, which is also the death. Sorry, that death is also the sin of the ego. So that is why that is the beast. And the question doesn't actually like the beast, but in some sense the question is married to that beast. I think that the shadow of the death is the question. And the shadow of the death can also connotatively associate and elaborate itself. It can transmute itself or update itself, perhaps. It can slightly modulate itself, at least. Within the ambit of its own character, it can essentially exceed. And as it exceeds its original starting point, as it grows, as it covers more territory, that territory is the king that is the thing that is actively operating the actual flow of focus between the six relay. It is the control center. So I think that just mapping out these are the fundamental characters, I think, that are keeping the false ego complex in operation. So anyway, I've just wanted to point that out and emphasize that, because I think that that's a very important model, and it helps understand everything and how essentially how things are reflective of what other things. But then essentially the real solution to this is essentially just to get the dominant function working, to get it functioning as a solitary, unified, unfragmented function, which at the same time will not be possible to do, or will directly confront one with the death of the superego, which is also the sin of the ego. So you will directly apprehend the death, which is also the sin. And so the only way to actually get the dominant function to not be fragmented, but to function in a unified way, is to entrench it into a living constitution that is the antithesis of the death, or at least displaces the death. And so a separate new creature, a new persona, a rebirth. And as that rebirth also then has to confront itself with, let's say, the remnants of the looming question, the shadow of the death that is continuing to operate but anyway, I think that essentially gets burnt up in the still small fire of the child function in the superego, which essentially is the lake of fire, which is absorbing and becoming the firewall that is preventing the parent function in the superego from reaching the superego's death and the ego's sin. So the child function becomes like a break in the influence of the false prophet. And so then the false prophet can actually be reinvigorated and reconstituted from the cleansing of that lake of fire back into the tree of life, which is, in some sense, I don't think the tree of life should be approached directly. It's not going to help you. You have to kind of excoriate the false prophet, and you have to and in some sense the tree of life is encapsulated within the dominant function, within the New Jerusalem. So it's actually the dominant function that needs to be rehabilitated. That is where essentially all the work is, until the false prophet is fully bound in as they say, the beast goes into perdition. So you've got two beasts. You've got sort of the beast on the question side of the six relays. Let's say the sacred contract that is implicit within the question, that is operating this relay system and focus on the six relays. And then you've got the beast, which is the death of the superego. And which is essentially the byproduct of the false prophet. And they are reflections of one another, but they're the let's say the day-to-day operating of the false ego complex of the six relays is just the shadow of the more important primordial sort of thing that needs to sort of be rectified in order to displace it. But I should maybe I need to think about it more in terms of, because I mean I have thought about fixing the superego. Perhaps there needs to be special steps that, but essentially it says that the beast will be left to even armor itself and gain its power and to gather its armies even, and then to come against the New Jerusalem, and then fire out of heaven will come and deal with them essentially. So I do think that you don't focus on the shadow. You don't go after the shadow. You let the shadow come up with the strongest permutation of the beast that it can, and you just focus on essentially rehabilitating uh, the death and the superego. Okay, so that's where I am. I think that's good enough. Yeah, that's all my current thinking on the matter. Okay, this is an addendum where I'm going to go into describing, I believe, this is slightly speculative, but I'm pretty sure that I'm going to touch on important distinctions that distinguish the properties and structure of narcissism and borderline. The sort of the problem comes into it is because I don't even have a full rendered understanding of, let's say, the kinds of structure around what I have, which I'm sort of symbolically bringing in the imagery of Revelations, the five fallen kings, and the king that is and the king that is yet to come. I don't exactly know how that operates in an ordinary false ego complex, in an ordinary person, where either the king that is yet to come is shifting within a set of six kings, where five are fallen and one is yet to come, and or if that's stable, if that's like a set anchor point, that after the king that is yet to come has sort of been structured into the particular defragmentation of the superego dominant function, which would be, let's say, the source code of which of the kings are the fallen and which is the king that is yet to come, which then is sort of everything is hinged on the anticipation of that, and the whole focus of the circuitry of the relays within the false ego complex essentially is structured around, in some sense, the anticipation of that it should come, of that there is something that should come that then should bring order to essentially the fallen nature of the or the futility of essentially these lost kings that can shift, let's say, the burden between one another and shift focus between one another, but essentially it's all hinged on uh, one of the six being sort of highly anticipated as holding the rudiment or the basic that is the key to the mystery of a particular gap, essentially, as to why the other five kings are in a fallen state, and shifting accountability or responsibility off on one another, or trying to make do in some sort of substandard way, and sort of cycling through different permutations to know what they should be anticipating about the king that is yet to come. And so they have to kind of sustain a in that collection that is somewhat supported by the question, a kind of suspended disbelief about, that there is still something that is yet to come that would, so holding together the quantification of that which should be anticipated in order to have a king that is yet come that might, in some sense, assuage the fallen or lost, or at least, I mean, perhaps that anticipation is not necessarily linked with redeeming the fallen kings, but at least it's essentially it's some kind of consolation, it's some kind of at least resolution, or it's some kind of contemplative um, resolution uh, um, to the fragmentation. But in some sense, there's no actual solution to the false ego complex. But anyway, but that's the structure that it's then obviously it has to be forged in some kind of arrested development of some kind of perpetual anticipation or something like that. So I don't know how to describe that within an ordinary person, if that is one of the six that then gets relayed around, or if it's stable, or if or if it's a bit of both, that it can shift, but it can also sort of get into grooves or sort of habitual patterns, and perhaps there are multiple variants, modes, as to why then people can shift from being subconscious focused to ego focused to unconscious focused, or that kind of thing. Or if they are super ego focused, then they can kind of see all of this happening on the other side, from in terms of the state of their fragmented dominant function, or at least the conditioned or imprinted upon death of the superego, which is also simultaneously the sin of the ego. So I'd say the sin of the ego, and perhaps which is directly connected with the asymmetry and the weird connection with the inferior function in the ego, which is, has to do with the work of the crucifixion and all that kind of stuff, is essentially the bridge to being super ego focused. You can't, I think, be in the super ego without some direct awareness of the sin of the ego. Anyway, and therefore the sin of the ego, which is being cast by the parent function in the super ego. So those are, I think, are the means of unlocking that perspective. Anyway, okay, so that's kind of like the ordinary person false ego complex, which, like as I said, I'm not exactly sure of the true amount of variance within that structure, or exactly, if I've got that structure completely well defined. But anyway, I've at least painted some kind of portrait of it, of some kind of the potential sort of variance within it. Okay, so which is enough of a stepping stone for me then, that I think I can perhaps speculate intelligently about the true architecture of narcissism and borderline personality disorder. So I still think that borderline personality disorder is fundamentally couched in the question. I think that borderlines do not take the 6 kings or the 5 fallen kings and the 1 king that is yet to come. I don't think they take that seriously. I think that they are somewhat operating the false ego complex from the point of the question. So, which is also the shadow of the death cast by the beast, the nature of the superego's death. So yeah, perhaps I've just misspoken, saying that it's centered around the question. I mean, because these things are related to one another. Anyway, maybe I should have started with narcissism first. Anyway, what I think is happening is that borderlines are refragmenting their dominant function. Because the state of the dominant function in the superego, I should have specified, is like a blueprint for the organization and the order of which of the kings is fallen and which of the king and which one of the 6 is yet to come. that is sort of being renegotiated. So the question is able to be recalibrated on the fly, holistically revised, or re-expressed or remodulated. So in some sense, the question is arbitrary for a borderline. And I would say that in some sense they have, therefore, it's probably more accurate to say that they have control over the question, and the thing that really has control over the question is the superego parent function. So I think that the borderline is actually identifying with the parent function. What their superego death, and which is also the ego's sin, has amounts to a stylistic formula, and that allows them essentially to sort of be superego parent function focused. So they are completely allied with the false prophet, essentially. And what that facilitates them doing is they can control the question. They can crank out the question reflexively, and which amounts to being able to reformat the fragmentation of the dominant function. They can sort of, like a snow globe, they can shake it all up and then have it land in different places, and recapitulate the the configuration. And so now I should have probably described narcissism first, because I think that what borderlines are actually also doing is that they are also doing that, what I've just described mechanistically, they're doing that, but they're doing that in order to sort of do something very similar to what narcissists, like they are what narcissists are living through, borderlines are orchestrating, sort of environmentally. But anyway, let me then just talk about narcissism first. Okay, so what I think narcissists are doing is narcissists don't have access to their question. Their question is an environmental projection. So they aren't, they don't have to live in the shadow of the death of the beast. So they are, they see themselves as the death. They model the death of, so in some sense they are in the valence. They are voicing essentially the beast, which is not the same thing as the false prophet. It is the false prophet. What the false prophet is doing in imprinting the function that corresponds to the death of the superego and the sin of the ego, how it leaves that is the beast. And so the narcissist really internalizes that imprint, that impression, or at least has a conscious reading of it. So in some sense they are so transfixed, or they have so much attention focused on the sin of the ego. So they are completely invested in being conscious of the sin of the ego. And therefore, to sort of survive that crushed ego, because the force of that beast, which is the sin of the ego, is weighing the ego down. The only way that then they can access the question is by its environmental projection. So it's sort of, it's I'm just making up words here when I say projection. I can't think of actually, I haven't really thought deeply enough about how to describe it, but essentially it's it's like an external locus of control. So yeah, I mean, usually when I talk about projecting an external locus of control, when I use the word projection, I mean to imply that it's sort of, it's cast off, but I feel like this might not be, it's not cast onto the external. Um, it's something like that. It can't be contained because the sin displaces it. The consciousness of the sin of the ego displaces the ability for it to be tracked under the auspices of one's own agency. And so anyway, the question is dislocated from the internal psychology of the narcissist. The the narcissist cannot understand, or does not have the internal resource to understand, that they are operating the false ego complex. So the false ego complex is a mystery machine that they are experiencing as an environmental pressure. Um, I'm trying to invoke the imagery of sort of living in water, like a fish in water. That because as an organism it doesn't breathe air, its gills take oxygen from water, because that's the kind of organism that a narcissist is. It therefore a weak metaphor anyway, but such a bad metaphor. I can't think of a good metaphor, but something I was going to make a point about, just sort of in atmospheric environmental pressure. But then you have to the only way to make that work is saying that the body is designed to take, or to needs that support from its environment, to sort of to orientate, to swim, or anyway, because otherwise the fins are, anyway, it's too much of a messy metaphor. But okay, so anyway, so what the narcissist is the narcissist is, I see the narcissist as being essentially a collection of the beast and the 5 fallen kings. And the narcissist is focused on the fallen kings, and can see the fallen kings, and can revel and indulge in the defective nature of let's say, the negative aspect of the false ego complex, which ordinary people would essentially assuage by anticipating the king that is yet to come. But the narcissist does not take ownership, or does not have a sensibility about the king that is yet to come, because it's on the perspective, it's on the wavelength of the beast and the 5 fallen kings. Those are all that it sees. And the king that is yet to come is connected with the question, is generated by the anticipation of let's say the positive animating force within the false ego complex, which it doesn't associate with, which is part of its external, it's part of an external locus of, I want to say it's an external mechanism. It's part of this sort of external locus of control, which is some kind of projection of psychology onto the atmospheric pressure, or something like that. Anyway, it can criticize, therefore, the question of other people that are providing the question environmentally. So I think the narcissist is trying to live in a collective psychology because it has all the reactive components of human psychology. It doesn't have the propitiative, positive impetus within the valence of the false ego complex. So because they don't identify the question, because that the question is located external to them as part of a set collection, they criticize the king that is yet to come, and they can see the state of the fallen nature, the shrapnel, the lostness of the component parts and how they don't gel, but they don't have a hope of how this would lead to the anticipation of a redeeming, or at least valiant, or sort of or some kind of answer or resolution, because they don't even contain the question that would be resolved. That's part of a kind of environmental drama uh, that they are trying to initiate by sort of agitation, or um, so I do think that there's a kind of there's an allergy to the question, which has been overrun by essentially this external location of the question. Let me just check my notes. I think I might have covered something there which I haven't quite reproduced well. Yeah, so anyway, okay. So I think that the narcissist, the reason why the character or the properties of narcissism exert itself essentially is because the narcissist does not want to step outside of the valence of the beast, which is itself like a very reactive, conditioned entity. I mean, look, I'm slightly metaphorically describing these things, but so essentially, the narcissist sees themselves in the valence of the beast, and it's such a permanent, steady structure. In fact, it's the hardest structure in the false ego complex, the beast, and therefore they don't want to lose that scaffolding, uh, which has essentially overshadowed the question, which they can't voice and read through their own sort of focus and attention on the other side. So they don't want to read the shadow. They see themselves as the thing casting the shadow, and they don't want to live in the shadow when they see that the shadow that they are casting is so um, uh, anyway, I think I'm getting slightly lost in some of this poetry. So okay, so the narcissist is identifying with the beast. So they're occluding their own question. So they don't have a positive impetus in their false ego complex. They don't have any positive impetus with which to actually track the king that is yet to come, which is kind of like the cohesive coalescence and functioning of the six relays. So they can't even necessarily track where they are in the six relays without some kind of drama or some kind of metered external track of a kind of external question, which is provided by the kind of the agitation which they are setting into the system in order to map themselves through kind of essentially an environmental reflection of the shadow which they need to collectively render. So the behavior of the introjective paradigm from which that they are garnering narcissistic supply is essentially, let's say, the substitution for the question. So because they don't have, let's say, an internal locus of question, they have to have an external locus of magnetic induction of the missing electricity from the question. So they have to have a magnetic field that will, so they have a magnetic field instead of an electric drive. Because they don't have a positively defined question, they need a negatively induced magnetic terrain and stomping grounds, essentially. So the territory essentially is the displacement for the question, the tracking the territory. So again, I think that they are seeing this through the eyes of the beast, essentially. And so what I think this also means is that they're not sensitive to the king that is yet to come, but they are sort of hunting it. But they're hunting it in other people as a competitor to disrupting their magnetic terrain. So other people's false ego complexes will have them anticipating a king that is yet to come, which is part of the positive, cohesive internal orchestration of their false ego complex. A narcissist needs to disrupt this so that they can turn this person into a participant within their magnetic sort of, what are they called? Terrarium. When people have, like little forests that they sort of put in fish tanks and they close the lid and it, has like an internal sort of ecosphere. Anyway, now I think that a borderline is essentially trying to follow that strategy that the narcissist is living out, but the borderline has further recourse to a deep that they also want to mold other people into a terrarium, into a terrain, into a domain, but a narcissist is like is on another level, has a kind of another trick that they can simultaneously that they can push the reset point. They can push a button that changes their own identity within the terrain, within the narrative. They also want a terrain and a narrative, but they're not willing to just sort of be the most important participant. They want to be able to change the reality within the terrain. They want to be able to say, well, unilaterally, on this day of the week, yes means no and no means yes. And on that day of the week, green is called orange and orange is called purple. Like it's just, they need to sort of control a higher, more, there's a higher level of, but it's not only, I guess narcissists could also be prone to those kinds of, let's say, kinds of manipulation and control, and could even perhaps fantasize or involve those sorts of things. But I guess what makes the borderline have the extra thing perhaps is that they want to be able to sort of recast themselves from the pieces of identity of anything that's within the terrarium. That they want to be able to. There was a movie, man, I can't remember what the movie. I think it was called like Dark City. This is a spoiler of the movie, which I think I can't even know if I got the name right. But in the movie, people would suddenly, everyone would freeze and people would come in and everyone would be injected with weird things, and they would move around things, and they would change the size of rooms, and they would change the role that the person had. They would change the identity and the job that the person had, and they would change all these things, and then they would continue. It was like a sort of a human experiment. And at the end of the movie, you actually realize that the whole city that they lived in was an imaginary thing that was actually floating around in space, and it was sort of controlled by these aliens that were doing experiments on these people, just to like understand human psychology better, or to see if someone could sort of see through or break the weird sort of control experiment. And that's very close to what I think borderline uh, wants. That if they see something that's part of someone's identity that they want to be able to sort of reset reality and to switch places, or but only but in a way in which that they can sort of abrogate towards themselves the chosen bits, and make sort of some kind of optimum amalgamate. And you can do that because, well, I mean, hypothetically, the power of the false prophet seemingly has the appearance of that capability. So, within the context of the false ego complex, hypothetically, you can do that. And they have just essentially identified with, let's say, the top power structure, the earliest power structure in the formation of the false ego complex. They have identified with the parent function and the superego that is placing conditions on the function, on the cognitive function, that corresponds with the death of the superego, which is also the sin of the ego. And so they are redefining the death, they are redefining their conditionality. And every time they do that, they are resetting the fragmentation of the dominant function in the superego. So their dominant function is getting formatted and reformatted. It's like when you change on a hard drive, from FAT32 to NTSF, or whatever the formats are. When you do that, you lose all the data. And that's what borderlines do, is they reformat their death, and then they correspondingly get sort of a redistribution of the fragmentation of the dominant function. And so essentially they are reclothing their question. They can completely reinvent the question on the fly, reflexively. And that's basically the identity dysregulation, but essentially it's all to do with the parent function of the superego. Okay, so now obviously, what's the point of resetting these things? You reset these things because you have high standards. Essentially, they already peg themselves as wanting to be, like, a narcissist actually has to do some real work to be a successful aggregator of narcissistic supply. A borderline can essentially try to punish their environment for not already making them a successful aggregator of narcissistic supply. That's I don't want to go into too much laborious detail, but that's essentially the difference between narcissists and borderlines. And I would almost say that borderlines um, therefore are simply Now, it's interesting because narcissists, in some sense, are in the valence of the beast. I think that narcissistic mortification will have to do with the standing of their beast, the conditioned function, and the parent function. And that sometimes they can see that sort of they're on the ascendant or they're on the decline in terms of living up to that there's a sort of there's a very fixed binary, let's say, law, which sort of has, let's say, psychopathic manifestations of being retrograde on the conditioning of the function. So there will be, the beast itself is a certain kind of knowledge about that function, which will make the function essentially static, or in a particular stasis, essentially. And in some sense, it doesn't give you that much, because if you really want to understand the content of what it means of what the death means, you really have to look at the dominant function in the superego. But I think that narcissists don't, they're not aware of the dominant function. Because if they were aware of the dominant function, they would have a sense of which of the six kings was yet to come. And whereas they, in some sense, can only see the five kings that are dead, because I think that maybe they, this is slightly speculating, but I think that they might have an awareness of the child function in the superego. But they use the child function negatively, essentially. I mean, the child function, I mean, in my own process of, let's say, therapy and self-actualization, I think that it all comes from the unification of the dominant function grounded in the life that is the reverse of the death. And, when I talk about the child function being a firewall against the parent function, and the child function is essentially, should eventually be the lake of fire and be the firewall that protects what is the burgeoning new life, the rebirth or whatever, from the parent function, from interference from the parent function, from the mark of the false prophet, or the imprintation. Anyway, if you alloy the death with the child function, you get a very incisive, cutting, fortified beast. The beast becomes strong. In fact, it becomes so strong that you don't want to indulge in the shadow of the beast, because you don't want to live in the question, because you just know that it's going to be cut down, that it's so fundamentally that nexus of the death, perhaps bolstered by the child function in the superego, or empowered by the child function in the superego, which is kind of like the other side, or the source code of the false ego complex. So why would you even try to involve yourself in the positive aspect of the false? And I do actually think that this is even discovered by most children. I think that this is even a phase of development. But I'm just trying to think when it would usually break down, or how it would be transitioned from that you would get sucked back into trying to get. I guess when this is discovered, all the kings aren't yet mapped out fully. And sort of it's some kind of curiosity that brings you back into the six relays of the false ego complex, just to sort of try work out some dynamism amongst them, or try to elaborate them more, or to sort of develop them further, and then sort of try to imagine an anticipation of which one of them is yet to come, that might, if it was, that if one of them might have unlocked the tension in all the others. So five of them can be given to be fallen, but just one of them has to be imagined that it can hold the key to answering the question, or to I shouldn't say that, because one of the six relays is called the answer, but maybe you don't want an answer, maybe you want something else. But in some sense, it's weird, because I think that the prayer, I mean, would actually does this function. So it's interesting that some of these things, I think, are anyway. I don't want to go down that tangent, but anyway, what is the point? So I'm talking about narcissism. I'm talking about I mean, it is true that the beast essentially is casting an obstacle against what I call the positive development of the false ego complex. Not positive as in happy, but positive just as in, I shouldn't even call it positive then, I guess, but in the sense that, like, a negative, when you develop a negative, you get a positive image. And so the superego is like the negative, and then the question and the beast are like the negative, and then the six relays are like the positive, which sort of reflect the negative, which are anyway. And at some point, people get transfixed by the positive image, and they actually get sort of incepted into their own false ego complex, where sort of they fall into the game that they have constructed and use it to substitute for the original state that even framed that game in the first place. And it would seem narcissists are half involved in the game, because they can see it, but they can't participate in it like other people, because they've only got one half. They never endorse their question. I wonder. The other thing as well is that, I don't know if it's even necessarily correct to say that these people don't have an ordinary false ego complex. It might just be that their particular metatype of where the general architecture of where these things are, like which particular function pertains to which cognitive function pertains to the death in the superego, which cognitive function pertains to the dominant function in the superego, which particular cognitive function pertains to, from the particular overlay of the architecture of the false ego complex onto the 17 model, it might just be that narcissism and even perhaps borderline is just permutation, not of a form of arrested development, but simply that's how those cognitive functions operate in that configuration, that this might just sort of be a particular metatype, how it functions. Or at least how it appears to function. That all the parts are actually doing their, but sort of it's an accident of the sort of the geometry of how those cognitive functions represent in that particular ordering. Anyway, okay, wait. Okay, so anyway, that's perhaps stupid of me to bring up that sort of that tone of doubt or that particular insight. I can't even. I mean, it could be that, for example, it is that their death, their ego death, sorry, their superego death, which is their ego sin, is like dimension 12 or something like that. And that just, anyway, anyway, so what should I go on to say? Anyway, that's, I mean, in some sense, even that thing that I'm speculating, it will be a particular configuration of the fragmented dominant function in the superego that will just have a particular, let's say, peculiar or a unique manifestation of how that metatype expresses itself or manifests. That essentially the metatype content or structure is seemingly bearing down and providing more rigidity than seemingly other types in the manifestation of their emotional tone circuitry. There's something about the content that is driving the whole personality type itself is manifesting this particular character of of behavior, which can be tracked through at least, or I'm speculating that if you find the metatype I must say, I mean, this is something that is somewhat bothering me, that my work is going to go to waste if I don't work out some kind of diagnostic tool to ascertain what metatype people are. Um, anyway, which I imagine at some point would be easier to just do by Metagram, because if you know the emotional tones, if you can pick up the emotional tones that people have, and then just, that's going to limit the pool of metatype very quickly, and then you'll only have a few candidate types from which to work out which it is, and then you can essentially use metatype, because just trying to type people's metatype without typing their metagram type is actually would be a lot easier if you could somewhat use a combination of both. But anyway, let me not change topics. Okay, so I'm talking about narcissism. So let me just think if I've said everything that I wanted to say. So I mean, this would be to say that there is something about the content. It's weird that there's something about the content of the question that is to experience the question as an external phenomena. That, I mean, because that would be the point of what I said, that essentially that no, this is just the expression of a particular metatype. Then it would be to say that no, this is not a dysfunctional false ego complex. It's just a false ego complex that seemingly doesn't have an internal locus around their question, and the question is sort of dispersed into a drama which is sort of being covertly um, impregnated into the atmosphere. So it's constantly being agitated or provoked or sort of instilled, being acted out. It's being farmed up, essentially, or it involves the subjugation of other people. It involves the coercive enlistment of other people um, as essentially pawns or participants. So a kind of unilateral enforcement or unilateral um, induction. So it could be something like investigating solipsism. I mean, at least from the borderline, that sort of makes sense. That it might actually be that borderline is an actual metatype manifestation, whereas narcissism is something like a broken, arrested development, and that would also uh, be coincidental with sort of the correlative data about borderlines seemingly being able to heal themselves or remodulate their schema and their strategy at a certain age. They can, in middle age and old age, they sort of um, they can actually spontaneously drop the borderline um, operating uh, uh, project. Uh, whereas narcissism cannot. Uh, or it might just be that, as I said, I mean, this is perhaps important speculation, but so it could also be what narcissism effectively is the projection of the false prophet. The source of the beast is affixed into a material, iconic. Essentially, it's regarded as not being psychological. It's regarded as being real or materially in the world. So essentially, the false prophet is not a psychological component for the narcissist. The narcissist does not experience the false prophet as a phenomenological uh, um, event, but as a material external um, scenario, or at least part of an actual history that is embedded in the ongoing environment. So it's part of the world, which is essentially connected with the the situation, which is always the terrain under the narcissist's feet. And so the narcissist has had their psychology um, cracked open and merged in the involvement of other minds. So it's kind of like an environmental, I get this sounds like garbage, but an environmental solipsism in which only they are the nexus and node of the beast, corresponding to the false prophet, which is shared by everyone in their domain. So it's sort of the idea that other people don't have. So I mean, this is a collective solipsism is a strange way of phrasing it, but I guess what I mean in practical terms is that there is one false prophet, that other people don't have their own false prophet, essentially. So the belief that everyone shares the narcissist's false prophet, and they can only contact the false prophet through the expression of the narcissist's valence as being or having their perspective in the valence of the beast, of the death, in the superego. So they are everyone's superego death. They are their environment's superego death. And therefore, everyone is collectively participating in generating the question, which the beast is, in some sense, the answer there too, although it's not quite the answer, but is is the dominant. As I've said before, the question is more like the shadow of the beast. They're more parallel to the question, and the beast are parallel to one another. They're not actually because they don't actually cohabitat a theater of the only thing that connects them is essentially is the crucifixion, is the work of the crucifixion, is the only thing that brings them into virtual contact with one another. Which is like the question taking responsibility for the sin of the ego. Even though the sin of the ego is a product of the world. Because, and this is complicated to get into because I didn't touch on this when I was talking earlier, because essentially let me just say that, like, in some sense we all are solipsistic, in the sense that we think that there is only one false prophet. But I do think that we can also have the appreciation that other people experience the false prophet in a different mode, in a different style. And that's also, what sort of warm empathy, I think, sort of entails, that your question is not the same as other people's question, but it essentially can have the same significance that it has to you. Now, the narcissist, in some sense, has an inverted question, in that they have an environmental drama that is collectively providing that role of the question. Where they are using other people as kind of as landmarks and benchmarks to know, in some sense, where to be the beastly focal point and nexus of criticizing which king has fallen and which is the one remaining king that is yet to come within their, what are they called, within their fish tank world, terrarium. Anyway, I do want to make a recording about politics now, which I do think is going to be highly relevant to this recording, but very indirectly, because it's just going to talk about borderline political manifestation of identity politics. But it's, anyway, I'll just put that all in the next recording, because I do think it's quite relevant to this.